It's time to let your sports opinions fly for the main event. A 7-team elimination match to decide the District 4 3A Championship. Presented to you live by PilotPointBearcats.com. This 10-week match has been sanctioned by the University of Interscholastic League. Our celebrity referee for the District 4 3A show is none other than the daytime psychology professor, Texas high school football storyteller, North Texas insider, and DFW Inside High School Sports, the most feared member of the Texas high school mafia, the one, the only, small-town Dixie, the professor,
very much for tuning in to the District 4 3A report, just a couple of days away from Rain-mageddon Round 2. And as we see all kinds of games moving and all kinds of chaos happening, we're going to break down everything the best that we can. And I'm going to start out today by talking a little bit about the Dave Campbell's ranking controversy that many of you know about. And just to reset, if you have no clue what we're talking about, it's something I've kind of hammered on the District 4 3A report repeatedly over the last few weeks, even going back into Brock requesting that Brock make it into the top 10, and finally they were able to make it in the top 10. But this week, Pottsboro was ranked in the top 10 at number 9 over Whitesboro, even though Pottsboro has no other good wins other than Mount Vernon. They're playing Mount Vernon this week, other than Winsboro, but they don't have any non-district wins of note. Meanwhile, Whitesboro has defeated Pottsboro straight up, and they have also defeated Bells, and then beating Paradise in non-district, or in district, as we'll talk about here as we break down the games this week. So getting into it, I actually had a moment where I apologize, Coach Fagan, if you're listening to this, that you're used as my example here, because this does impact your team. But I have Coach Fagan over here on my shoulder. We'll call it the ego. In Freudian terminology, you've got the id, which is the devil. You've got the superego, which is the angel, and you have the ego, which is the judge that kind of mitigates between the id and the superego. And now you have a psychology lesson as part of the District 4 3A report, which is not part of the curriculum here. But I've got Coach Fagan, whispering in my ear. This is metaphorical, not literal. Like Diggs, we control what we can control. We don't worry about what we can't control. We strive to get better every week. We move on. And when I consider that, talking about that, is it really a pointless, is it really a purposeful endeavor to spend the first 10 minutes of this show just completely lambasting Dave Campbell's for that? And my inner Coach Fagan says, no, we control what we control. We don't, we can't control what we can't control. Let's move on and get better. I will apologize for Whitesboro, on behalf of Dave Campbell's, on behalf of sports writers. I think it's an egregious oversight. I feel bad for Whitesboro as far as that goes, but at the end of the day, you can't control it. So I think we all know what happened on the field, that Pottsboro and Whitesboro played, and Whitesboro was the better team. And why Whitesboro is not ranked and Pottsboro is, only the people who are in that room know about that. I even went to go check out the Pottsboro the box scores that they have on Max Prep to see if they got a quarterback in return to where they can say, oh, this player came back. We're much better. If that game would have happened again, maybe it would be different. It's the same cast of characters. They've stayed healthy. We know that Whitesboro has stayed pretty healthy as far as that goes. So that just kind of falls into it is what it is. And I think it'll kind of bear itself out on the field, especially if Whitesboro makes it to the third or fourth round, and we'll see this week as Pottsboro takes on Mount Vernon if they're able to maintain that and go to a 9-1 schedule. And obviously, that's something that Whitesboro, even if they don't have the satisfaction of getting to have, one of the Kinsey come out, Kinsey come out and say, number 9, Whitesboro against Ponder this week, even though they can't officially do that. I think they can look at that thing and say, you know what, we beat that team, and we can own that, and we can be proud of that. So, even though I said I wouldn't belabor it, I guess I'll probably talk for a couple of minutes about it. But that's pretty much all I have to say about that. I think if Pottsboro and Whitesboro played again, Whitesboro would win again. And if both teams can make it to the state semifinals, I guess we'll get to see that game one more time and find out who's right. And that kind of falls into control what you can control. And I think Whitesboro has to feel very good, at least of their opportunity to make it to the state semifinals and beyond this year. So, breaking down the results from last week, we had 3 pretty big games, and we'll start out in Brock as Brock took on Ponder this past week, and it was an absolute domination from Brock, and we kind of expected it. Brock was up 62-13 at halftime, and then in the second half they pretty much ran a lot of different players in there to make the finals 74-27. And really with Brock, again, they do this on the ground. Brett Tutter, 16 carries for 318 yards, 5 touchdowns. Pretty much anytime Brock touched the ball, they were able to do something special with it. Tyler Moody got into it, running 5 times for 52 yards and 2 touchdowns. Throwing the ball, 10 for 15 for 160 yards and 3 touchdowns. And I'm a little concerned about this, to be honest. I know Brock wants to keep it on the ground if possible, but they had an opportunity, and I get it was raining and all of that. But this was just to me, an opportunity to really have some video game stats for Tyler Moody, and kind of show that Brock can be a hybrid team and throw it down the field when they need to. I thought Brock looked really good against Gunter in the second half of that game, throwing the ball. But their identity is running the ball. At probably some of their best players on the offensive and defensive lines. When you look at things again, that you really see that they still don't have all of their running backs in return. They're not all there. I misspoke last week. I said Cotton did not play for Brock, and I was pointed out that was untrue. He did play, but Reed Watkins is still missing from the stat sheet. So if there is an injury there, hopefully he gets back and gets back well. And speaking of injuries, we know that Paradise has a couple of injuries, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But looking at Ponder, again, Clifton Cooper, maybe offensive MVP. It's going to be hard with Mac Harper, who has a pretty good case for offensive MVP, but he also has a pretty good case for overall MVP. So just kind of depends on how that works out. Some of these players that we're talking about, when they're having to go and do these all district meetings and figure out who's going to be the MVP, offensive MVP, and even breaking down the first teams, there are some really good players in District 4 3A. We have been blessed to see just some of these top players. Case Peacock had a huge day receiving, 5 receptions for 144 yards and 2 touchdowns. And again, Clifton Cooper, 300 yards and 3 touchdowns against Brock's defense. And again, that was mostly second half yardage. But again, Brock, 2 turnovers. Just, I don't understand. And it might be and with fumbles late in the fourth quarter, breaking that down, but just the repeated multiple turnovers for Brock every single game. That's just becoming more and more of a trend, and you got to get that cleaned up if you're going to be successful in the playoffs. And Brock still hasn't cleaned it up. But I mean, what can you say when it's 62-13? Those are the stats that you're going to remember. 62-13 at halftime, and then obviously the 74-27 final. Big game with Pilot Point and Peaster. Pilot Point needed to max out their victory to make it a no-brainer, to where if Peaster beats Boyd, they have an opportunity to make the playoffs. And Pilot Point did just that, winning that game 32-6. And even though it looks a little off one-sided, that game was 8-6 at halftime. Pilot Point outscored Peaster 24-0 in the second half. And from what I can gather in digging into the stats, Pilot Point was the recipient of 4 turnovers and played a clean game. And when you have a situation where you have 4 turnovers, you're getting the +4. You're gonna win those games kind of lopsided. So I think if you're kind of, Pilot Point is probably looking at that, happy that they won by that much, but at the same time knowing that Peaster has a legitimate shot against Boyd this week, because if Peaster doesn't have 4 turnovers, they probably make that much closer, if not even beat Pilot Point, or at least keep it as a one-score game, since that game was 8-6 at halftime. Wyatt Smith, another efficient game in the rain, 8 for 19, 159 yards and 2 touchdowns, and really rushing the ball is what they had to do. There was 51 carries in the game. Wyatt Smith had 20 of those for 41 yards and 2 touchdowns. Gage Anderson, 25 for 97. And then Ashton Kirby, what can you say about this kid at a receiver? Talking about the players who are going to see the all-team, first-team all-district, Ashton Kirby. I saw a stat that I think he posted himself, or maybe PilotPointBearcats.com posted for him, that according to Max Preps, he's top 25 in the state of Texas in receiving the ball, and top 100 in the nation. And really, I mean, these are video game numbers. I was helping Coach Benedetto. If you don't know, I'm a big Plano East guy. That's my, my inner side is I'm to Plano East what Pilot Point and all of the Bearcat Nation is to their program as far as that goes. I don't even know what that means, but I do know that, for instance, I was helping him compile some of the top yardage, some of the rushing and scoring leaders, so some of the players for Plano East had an opportunity to know where they could sit. And I believe the all-time receiving record at Plano East is only 810 yards. So Ashton Kirby, we still have one game left. He's over 1,000. That lets you know what a great time that is. I'd love to know, Pilot Point Bearcats, I know you're listening since you host our show, what is the all-time record? I know you've got some all-time records and whatnot. Does Ashton Kirby have the all-time record for receiving for Pilot Point? I mean, I can't think, especially in this world, especially given in the 70s and 80s at Pilot Point with Chie Moore and all of that was mostly a running team. So Ashton Kirby with over 1,000 yards could be setting the all-time Pilot Point record, and if so, well deserved. If not, let me know, and we'll tweet it out on who the record holder is, and maybe what this game coming up he'd have to get to be able to pass that against Brock. A Thursday night game now instead of a Friday night game. So Pilot Point created the turnovers defensively and was able to defeat Peaster despite having a very limited roster as far as their depth goes. But in the rain and able to collect turnovers, able to get interceptions and fumbles, that was the recipe for the victory. And with that, they have set themselves up perfectly to have an opportunity to make the playoffs. Finally, we've got Paradise versus Whitesboro, and if you missed the second quarter, you missed the game, because all 4 touchdowns were scored in the second quarter. Started out with Grayson Ledbetter with a 37-yard run. Grayson Ledbetter had a 16-yard run. Then you had Sanders from a 32-yard pass from Harper, and then Aiden Winters from Austin Iglesias to end the second quarter. And that was pretty much the scoring as far as that game goes. But I think the story in multiple storylines in that game, first of all, that Whitesboro was able to hold Paradise to 70 total yards. 70 total passing yards and 17 total rushing yards. So we're dealing with 87 total yards. When you think of Whitesboro, you don't really think of their shutdown defense, but to hold Whitesboro to 87 total yards, 70 passing, and 17 rushing. We've talked about how Austin Iglesias, he's right up there in that MVP discussion as well with Mac Harper and the players we've talked about repeatedly. Even Brett Tutter, if he was playing as the primary back, he would be in that discussion, and Clifton Cooper. But to hold Austin Iglesias to 17, just that many yards, limited yards, I think that really speaks to Whitesboro and how they're growing as a team. And Whitesboro was able to put up over 400 yards in that game, even though that the scores didn't show. didn't show that kind of big numbers. You would think if you scored 400 yards, maybe score 30, 40 points. But mistakes and sloppy field position, sloppy field conditions kept Whitesboro a little bit at bay. But still, just big numbers straight down the road for Whitesboro. And again, Grayson Ledbetter, what can you say about him? Just another amazing. If he's in the game, he's getting 200 yards. It feels like. And again, talking about MVP candidates, how about that? And then Mac Harper was able to run the ball 19 times for 73 yards as well, and then also throw the ball intermittently, 7 for 10, 70% when you're dealing with the rain conditions that we had last week. Pretty good. Also able to throw a touchdown. Jay Sanders, as we talked about, caught that 32-yard touchdown. Brett Donaldson, 4 for 24, and Clay Hermes, 2 for 16. Our receiving core at Whitesboro continues to be successful, and they showed that they can win on the ground, and they've shown they can win through the air. So it really shows me a multiplicity of abilities for Whitesboro to win in cold weather, going out to West Texas, win in the rain. Uh, it travels very well. So Whitesboro with a big win, a convincing win. When you look at the fact, calibrate Paradise versus Whitesboro, and then Paradise versus Brock, Whitesboro looked much better against Paradise than Brock did by every metric. So this week we have three big games that will ultimately determine where the playoffs go, and the only game that really matters as far as playoff seeding and who's going to make the playoffs is Boyd versus Peaster. And because of Pilot Point's max win over Peaster last week, then we are at a situation where Peaster just has to beat Boyd even by 1 point, and if they can do that, they will make it to the playoffs. From what I've seen so far, they have not moved the game, but I've also seen that the storm system is moving from west to east. And Abilene, for instance, is supposed to be clear by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Obviously, Boyd is a little further west than some of the Metroplex area teams out there. So it's possible that this game will be a relatively normal, not playing until 11 o'clock game. It's also possible that on Wednesday they decide to move it to Thursday, and that will be that. But at least as far as when I'm taping this on Tuesday night, that game is still currently listed as a Friday game. I would feel a lot better about picking Peaster in cleaner conditions on a Thursday as opposed to Friday, because obviously 4 turnovers, that speaks to their system and how they run the ball and how their offensive setup. It doesn't really present itself to play in the elements very well, whereas Boyd can run the ball with their multiple running backs, as we've talked about, Gavin Rosado, and just able to slow down that game and suck the wind out of the ball and make it a very constricted, low possession sort of game. Because we don't know what the conditions are going to be, I'm going to pick Boyd in this game, but I think that Peaster is certainly able to be competitive. If Peaster can clean up the turnovers, it would not surprise me to see Peaster win this game. If it moves to Thursday, I would feel better about picking Peaster to win this game, but given the elements, given what we're expected, given the fact that there will probably be a wet ball, I think Boyd's offense just works a little bit better. For that's probably why they're not going to move the game, given that they have the home game and they ultimately have the final say. If both teams have to agree to move it, but Boyd, if they want to keep it there, they can shut it down even if Peaster would want to move it, since they do control the home game ultimately, unless the DEC got involved, but I don't think that's happening. I know some of the districts as a whole made the decisions to move, but I've already heard of a couple of situations in 6A where one team wants to play in the rain because they think it gives them a better chance. So that could be the situation. Obviously, I'm not privy to what the Boyd coach is thinking about that, but just from what we know about the District 4 3A report, I would say that's kind of that would be my mindset anyway. So I've got Boyd with a slight edge over Peaster right now. Pilot Point versus Brock has moved to Thursday. I think Brock is going to be a heavy favorite. I just don't think that Pilot Point has the depth to stay up with Brock. That was a game that I got to kind of cover last year, and Brock was not as dominant as you would think they would be. I think Brock will be a little bit more dominant this just because of the depth and running the ball that they'll have on Pilot Point. I think that Brock wins maybe a 42-7 sort of game, maybe 49-7. And then Whitesboro versus Ponder. It's going to be another one of those games that Whitesboro's offense against Ponder's defense. I think Whitesboro will be able to name its score, and there'll be some game management in the second half. They've moved this game to Thursday as well. I think Whitesboro will probably, put up 50-60 in the first half, and then Ponder will get its second half scores, able to move the ball, and depending on how Whitesboro manages it, again, that will probably more determine the score. I think Whitesboro will probably win in that 40 to 50 point range, 5 or 6 scores. But again, I mean, Ponder is good enough offensively to score late, as Whitesboro might be playing some younger kids, and take off the gas a little bit. So again, it's hard to calibrate what is a blowout, and comparing this blowout and that blowout, you can't really compare it. But I think Whitesboro will get to name its score. Looking at District 3, 3A, and to kind of determine our first round playoff games, we're probably going to be dealing with ties. So there's quite the more games that are of matter. Just every game matters in District 3, 3A this week, and can impact the seeding as far as that goes. Jim Ned and Iowa Park will play for ultimately the first seed, and because of the way tiebreakers work, if Iowa Park is able to win, they will be the 1 seed. But if they lose and everything else goes to as planned, meaning Breckenridge and Vernon beat Bowie and Clyde, then Iowa Park will drop down to the 4 seed. They could stay potentially the number 2, the number 2 seed if they are able to win, or if they won't ever. As far as I can tell, they can only be the 1 seed or the 4 seed. Breckenridge can be the 2 seed or the 3 seed, depending on what happens. If they win and Vernon wins and they get into that 3-way tie with Iowa Park and Breckenridge, then they'll be the 2 seed in that 3-way tie. If they end up losing, if Breckenridge and Vernon both lose to Bowie and Clyde, and it creates a 3-way tie for 3rd place, Breckenridge would end up being the 3rd seed as far as that goes, because Breckenridge, Vernon, and Iowa Park, or Breckenridge, Vernon, and Bowie would be tied, and Breckenridge would be guaranteed to win that tiebreaker. And then Bowie is part of that victory over Vernon, hypothetically, which I'm not picking. But if they hypothetically won that game, they would need to win by 11. And if they could win that game by 11, then Vernon would be out, and Bowie would be able to make the playoffs in their place. Clyde has no chance of making the playoffs. Vernon is likely to be the 3rd seed, the 4th seed, or not make it. We talked about how they would not make it. In the 3-way tie with Breckenridge, Vernon, and Iowa Park, they could only be the 3 seed because Breckenridge would be the 2nd seed, Vernon would be the 3rd seed, Iowa Park would be the 4th seed. In that 3-way tie with Breckenridge, Vernon, and Bowie, Vernon would end up being the 4th seed since they're locked in right now at 7, as long as they make the playoffs. Because Breckenridge is locked in at that 3rd seed. That would be the case where they would have to lose, but lose by less than 11. They would still end up being the 4th seed. So as things are, if everything goes to plan, in this district, nothing really has gone to plan in District 3, 3A. Jim Ned, I think, is a favorite over Iowa Park. I think Breckenridge is a favorite over Clyde, and I think Vernon is a favorite over Bowie. Computer polls and analytics have Clyde and Bowie 3 to 4 scores better than Bowie and Clyde. And then Jim Ned and Iowa Park is kind of a 50-50 game, but Jim Ned has been playing way above their pay grade the last couple of weeks. They've really gotten hot as far as district goes, so I think Jim Ned will probably be a 2-score favorite, even though the computer analytics might disagree with me. As far as District 1 and 2, everything is going pretty much as we expected. You're going to see Denver City, Brownfield, Kermit, and La Mesa as your 4 teams in District 1. And then Shallow Water, Bushland, Muleshoe, and Dalhart will end up being your 4 teams in District 2. Amarillo River Road, even if they upset Shallow Water this week, they would lose the tie to Dalhart. And even if Dalhart, if Muleshoe lost as well, if Dalhart and Muleshoe play this week, Amarillo River Road couldn't win either of those ties since they're playing Shallow Water, and they've already lost to Muleshoe and Dalhart. So all 4 of those teams are in. and they'll be playing the first round, District 1 versus District 2. More germane to the District 4 3A report is District 3. So I think our current projected games will be Brock versus Iowa Park, Whitesboro versus Vernon, Paradise versus Breckenridge, and Jim Ned versus Boyd. So those will be some of the neutral site games that you'll be thinking about, and we'll obviously talk about where those games will be and how that travel might impact where things may be as we get more information going into next week. So that'll be a fun thing to look at. Looking at those teams just kind of briefly, and obviously we'll do a deeper dive next week. As of right now, Jim Ned is 6-3. Their losses, they started out 0-3. They lost to Holly, Holiday, and Wall. Lost 3-0 to Holiday, or 3-0 to Wall, 41-19 to Holiday, and 30-7 to Holly. And they've won 6 straight from there. Iowa Park is 4-5 right now. They lost to Holiday as well. They lost to Burke Burnett. They lost to Graham. And they lost to Wichita Falls, and then they lost to Breckenridge in district. Breckenridge is 7-2. They had a good win over Jacksboro, so that kind of lets you know that they beat Jacksboro by 29, and then Jacksboro beat Boyd by 1. So a little bit of calibration early. Obviously, things can change from week 1 and week 2 to week 10, but that kind of lets you know where they are, and their 2 losses were in district to Vernon and Jim Ned. And then Vernon at 5-4, they lost to Idalou and Burke Burnett before also losing in district to Iowa Park and Jim Ned. So they will be looking to defeat Bowie this week to clinch their playoff spot and potentially play Whitesboro in the first round. Just kind of thinking about where Vernon and Whitesboro would play. I don't know. There's not a lot between, from in between Gainesville and Vernon in the middle there. Wichita Falls is obviously a lot closer to Vernon as far than Whitesboro. So I don't know where they would find middle ground. I guess they might maybe go south. Might be where they end up finding their neutral site. Who knows? We will have to check that out next week based on how those coaches make those decisions. So that's been the District 4 3A report. I won't, again, bash Dave Campbell's too much for the travesty of justice, what I call rankings malfeasance. I think they should have definitely ranked Whitesboro over Pottsboro. But, again, they did what they did, and we will prove it on the field. Because remember, the District 4 3A report went all the way to the end last year. I'm hoping that the District 4 3A report will continue to go 4, 5, or 6 rounds deep again this season. Because as long as there's a game in District 4 3A, I will be here to talk about it. I'm your Professor Matt Diggs. Thank you for tuning in again to the District 4 3A report. And go ahead and tune me out of this thing.
Woo, 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 woo. I ain't leaving.